Chapter 12. The west wall of the Resonum Entertainment Complex was dirty and salt-encrusted, discolored with age and pitted by the debris from the explosion 15 years earlier that had leveled the rival gambling hall down the street. From the far side of the 50-meter depression that marked the explosion's center, the Resonum's west wall was said to be rather attractive, the random bits of damage weaving themselves into intriguing visual patterns, particularly in the shifting glow of the Borkorash sunset. But sunset was long past, and Shada wasn't on the far side of the pit anyway. She was three-quarters of the way up the west wall, digging her climbing hooks carefully into the various cracks and cavities, and from this perspective, all she could tell was that the wall was dirty and not much fun. Join a smuggling group, she thought darkly for about the fifth time since beginning her climb. Visit a side of the galaxy the tourists never see. It wasn't fun, but it was necessary. Very soon now, Mazik and Griv would be escorted onto the Resonum's ultra-private top floor for a meeting with the smooth-talking Kubaz, who represented the shadowy Hut crime cartel. Griv was carrying a small case full of Rill. The Kubaz would be carrying a similarly sized case full of Summerhill fire gems, and in theory the gathering would break up with a simple and mutually profitable exchange. In theory. Somewhere in the distance off to her right, an airspeeder swung around in preparation for landing, and as its landing lights sent a brief splash of pale illumination across the wall in front of her, Shada felt a fresh surge of depression sweep through her. She hadn't been home to Emberline for over 12 years now, not since Mazik had hired her on as his bodyguard, but the grime and deterioration of this wall had brought all those memories back as if it had been yesterday. Memories of growing up amid the ruins of what had once been great cities. Memories of the death that had struck so often around her. Death by disease, by malnutrition, by violence, by hopelessness. Memories of pervasive hunger, of eking out of existence by the vermin she was able to catch and kill, and on her share of the meager foodstuffs that came in from what was left of the countryside's arable land. And on the outward supplies that finally began coming in. Supplies not donated by caring off-worlders or a generous republic, but earned by the blood and sweat and lives of the Mistral Shadow Guards. They were the elite of what remained of Eberline society, commissioned personally in their crusade by the 11 elders of the people, and from her earliest childhood, Shada had wanted with all her heart to be one of them. The Mistral roamed the Star Lanes, a sisterhood of exquisitely trained warrior women, hiring out their services and combat skills to the oppressed and powerless of the galaxy, and receiving in exchange the money vital for keeping the remnants of their devastated world alive. A world whose people no one had ever even noticed, let alone cared about. Unlike, say, Kamas. With an effort, she choked down the ripple of resentment at all the attention Kamas had been getting the past couple of weeks. The destruction of Emberline was too far in the past to get emotional about any more, even for her. No one in the galaxy had cared back when it had attacked. They certainly couldn't be expected to care now. Yes, it was unfair, but no one had ever claimed the universe was fair. From just above and to her left came a soft, questioning burp. Shada paused, looking up into the darkness, and spotted the reflection from a pair of close-set eyes looking down at her from deep shadow. "It's okay," she murmured towards the eyes, cautiously pulling herself up for a closer look. On this part of Barkarash it was probably a harmless Blufferavian, but it never hurt to be careful. The caution turned out to be unnecessary. It was indeed a Blufferavian, resting on a nest built into a particularly deep niche in the wall. From beneath its wings she caught a glimpse of a couple of speckled eggs. "Don't worry. I'm not hungry," she soothed the creature. Once upon a time, she remembered darkly, she'd been quite good at catching avians that size. They tasted much better than the city's scavenger insects. Shaking away the thoughts, she shifted her weight to free up one hand and pulled a safety anchor off her climbing harness. Her Mistral instructors would probably have criticized her use of a safety line, pointing out that it took time to fasten the anchors and that a true Mistral would never slip in the first place. But her climb training was many years in her past, and all the speed in the galaxy would gain her nothing if she fell before reaching the rooftop. On the other hand, If there was anything to Mazik's suspicions about this meeting, getting up there too late would be just as futile as not getting there at all. About 2 meters of wall left, she estimated as she glanced upward, with maybe twice that number of minutes left before Mazik and Griv arrived upstairs. Locking the slender, nearly invisible safety line into the anchor, not waiting until the faint hiss of the molecular welding between anchor and wall had faded away, she passed the bluffer avian's nest and continued her climb. She had made it to the top and was just reaching a hand up towards the edge when she heard a faint sound. She froze, listening, but the sound wasn't repeated. Easing her hand down, she pulled another safety anchor from her harness and set it against the wall as far to her left as she could reach. Hoping the hissing sound was too quiet to be heard by whoever was up there, she locked her safety line into the anchor and also locked the feed in her harness. Now, if she was shot at when she poked her head up over the edge, dropping down would swing her around that point in the tight arc to pop up 1.5 meters to the side. It wasn't much, but in a gunfight, the ability to throw off an opponent's aim even that much could make all the difference. Easing her blaster from its holster, she flicked off the safety. "Hello, Shada," a soft voice said from directly above her. She looked up. A cloaked figure was standing at the edge looking down at her, but even in the gloom, Shada could see enough of the other's face. "Carolee?" she murmured. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Carolee Duillan said. "Just put your blaster up here on the roof, would you? Then come on up." Shada reached up and set the weapon beside Carolee's feet. Then, remembering to unlock the line feed from her harness, she pulled herself the rest of the way. Straightening up, she took a quick look around. Here at the edge of the roof was flat, but a few meters inward it rose at a sharp angle another meter or so before flattening out again. Beyond the rise, Shada could see the top of the long skylight enclosure that crowned an upper room. The room where Mazik was about to get down to business. "You're probably the last person I would have expected to see up here," she commented, looking back at Carolee. "I imagine so," Carolee agreed. She'd picked up the blaster while Shada was finishing her climb and now tucked it away somewhere inside her cloak. "You can take off those climbing hooks, too. We'll be going back down by one of the interior stairways. Just set them down on the roof, if you would." "Of course," Shada said, unstrapping the hooks from her forearms and setting them down on the roof beside her. They weren't all that useful as weapons, but Carolee obviously wasn't interested in taking chances. Kneeling down, she undid the foot hooks as well, then straightened up again. "Happy?" Carolee pursed her lips. "You act as if we're enemies, Shada. We're not." "I'm glad to hear that," Shada said, studying the younger woman's face. It had indeed been a long time since they'd worked together. Almost 20 years, in fact, since Tatooine and that near fiasco with the Imperial's Hammer Tong project. The memory Shada had brought away from that incident was one of Carolee as young and inexperienced, and a bit prone to becoming flustered. But the memory wasn't the woman who now stood before her. Sometime in those 20 years, Carolee had developed grace and poise, and an air of considerable competence. "How did you know I'd be coming up this side?" "We didn't," Carolee said, shrugging. "The rest of the approaches to the rooftop are also being watched. But I thought I spotted you slipping around the side of the building in that layered blue dress of yours, and I guessed you might try this way." She gestured to Shada's elaborately coiled and plaited hair, then at their tight-fitting combat jumpsuit and climbing harness. "I must say, the dress suited that hairstyle better than the fighting gear. What are those things holding it together?" "They're lacquered Zenji needles," Shada told her. "Mazik likes me to look decorative." "Useful camouflage for a bodyguard," Carolee said. "Speaking of camouflage, I'd guess one of the needles must be a disguised signaler or comlink. Just drop it on the roof, all right?" Shada grimaced. "You don't miss a trick, do you?" she said, pulling the signaler out from its place behind her right ear and adding it to the pile of climbing hooks. "I'm so glad we're not enemies. Who is this we you mentioned?" "I have a client with me." Carolee nodded towards the higher section of roof. "He's over there." "Crouched beside the skylight with a sniper's blaster rifle?" "Doing what?" "Nothing that concerns you," Carolee said. "As of right now, you've been pulled off the job." Shada frowned at her. What are you talking about? I've been with Mazik for over 12 years now. You can't end that kind of relationship with the snap of a finger. We can, and we are, Carolee said. It's clear now that Mazik's group isn't going to become the galaxy-spanning organization that the Mistral hoped when they first planted you on him. And with Talon Card's Smugglers Alliance all but defunct, the 11 have decided that you're just being wasted here. It's time for you to move on. Fine, Shada said, taking 2 steps back away from Carolee along the roof edge and craning her neck as if trying to see if she could catch a glimpse of Carolee's client. I'll tell Mazik tonight that I'm resigning as his bodyguard. We can leave in the morning. Carolee shook her head. I'm sorry. We leave now. Shada looked back, leveling a hard stare at Carolee and surreptitiously gauging the distance between them. 3 meters. Just about right. Why? She demanded. Because your new client wants to murder him? Even in the dim light, she could see Carolee wince a little. But when the other woman spoke, her voice was firm enough. I suggest you try to remember who we are, Shada, she said. We're Mistral. We're given orders, and we follow them. I'm also Mazik's bodyguard, Shada said quietly. And once upon a time, the Mistral were given the honor and obeyed duty, not just orders. Carolee snorted under her breath. Honor. You have been out of touch, haven't you? Apparently so, Shada countered. I've always tried to believe that being a Mistral put me a few steps above the garbage heap of mercenaries and assassins for hire. Forgive my naivete. Carolee's face darkened. We do what's necessary to keep our people alive, she bit out. If some slimy hut wants to backblade some other slimy smuggler, that's none of our concern. Correction. It's none of your concern, Shada said. It is mine. I have a job to do, Carolee, and you can get out of my way or you can get hurt. She reached up to her harness and locked her safety line. Carolee's hand seemed to twitch, and suddenly there was a small blaster in it. Freeze it, she ordered. Move your hands away from your body. Empty. Shada held her arms loosely out from her sides, fingers spread to prove she wasn't holding or palming anything. You'll have to kill me to stop me, she warned. I hope not. Now turn around. This was it. Arms still held away from her body, Shada rotated 90 degrees to face the skylight, and taking a step backward, she dropped off the edge of the roof. She'd half expected Carolee to get a quick blaster shot off before she disappeared over the edge. It didn't happen. Carolee either freezing with surprise or else too self-controlled to fire uselessly. But Shada didn't have time to speculate on which it was. The safety line snapped taut, and suddenly she was caromming off the wall as she swung down and to her right, pivoting about that last anchor she'd set near the rooftop. Another 2 seconds, she estimated, and she would pass the midpoint of her oscillation and swing up again to the rooftop, where Carolee and her blaster waited. She had those 2 seconds to find a way to take down her one-time friend. The startled Bluffaravian didn't even have time to squawk as Shada snatched it from its nest. She managed to grab one of the eggs with her other hand, and then she was swinging back up towards the roof. And her 2-second grace period was over. Even as she cocked the bird over her shoulder in throwing position, Carolee appeared above her at the edge of the roof, hurrying towards the spot from which Shada had jumped, her eyes and blaster tracking down the side of the building. She caught sight of Shada, floundered off balance for a split second as she tried to halt her forward movement and shift her aim, and with a grunt of exertion, Shada hurled the Bluffaravian at her face. There was no time for Carolee to think, no time for her even to pause and evaluate. There was a sudden confused flurry of wings in front of her as the Bluffaravian tried to recover its equilibrium, and in the absence of thought, powerfully ingrained Mistral combat reflexes took over. She jerked back, the movement eroding her precarious balance even further, twisting the muzzle of her blaster towards the incoming missile, and fired. The blaster bolt caught the Bluffaravian dead center, and suddenly the flapping wings became a turmoil of flame and sparks and acrid smoke. Carolee ducked away from the fireball, twisting her head to the side, just in time to catch Shada's thrown Bluffaravian egg squarely across the bridge of her nose. She gasped as the egg splattered into her eyes, throwing her free hand up to try to wipe away the semi-liquid mass blinding her as Shada's hid her safety line feed release again and vaulted up onto the rooftop. Circling a couple of meters to her right to get out of the line of fire of the blaster still waving in her general direction, she angled in. She reached Carolee just as the younger woman got her eyes cleared, kicking the blaster out of her hand as she tried to bring the weapon around towards her. The blaster hit the edge of the roof behind Carolee and bounced off into the darkness below. Shatter! Carolee hissed the old curse, jumping to her right out of Shada's reach and producing a gleaming knife from somewhere. Shada! I'm obeying my duty, Shada said, stepping to her right, away from the knife tip. You've still got the option of getting out of my way. Carolee hissed something else and lunged forward. Shada sidestepped again towards her right, faded towards Carolee, took another quick step to the side, and then changed direction back towards the skylight. But Carolee had anticipated the move. Blinking more of the egg out of her eyes, she took a long step the same direction, her knife waving warningly. Shada countered by stepping perilously close to the roof edge and taking two quick strides along it in an attempt to get around onto Carolee's left side, away from her knife hand. Carolee spun around in response, knife held ready. Don't make me do this, Shada, she snarled. Snarled. And yet, Shada thought she could hear a buried note of pleading there as well. All right, Carolee, she said softly. I won't. Snapping on her climbing harness's feed lock again, she leapt backwards one last time along the edge of the roof, and the safety line that had carefully choreographed sparring maneuvers and threaded neatly around behind Carolee snapped up tautly to catch the younger woman across the tops of her low boots. Flailing her knife uselessly as her feet were yanked out from behind her, she fell with a painful-sounding thud flat onto her back. Shada was on her in an instant, one foot coming down on Carolee's knife wrist as she slapped away the other hand, and then jabbed stiffened fingertips into the soft spot beneath her rib cage. With an agonized grunt, Carolee folded up around the impact and toppled over on her side. Shada jabbed again, this time behind Carolee's ear, and the younger woman relaxed and lay still. Breathing hard, Shada reached over and snatched the knife from Carolee's limp hand, cutting her safety line before she wound up tangled in it herself. The fight hadn't taken long and had been reasonably quiet, but odds were that Carolee's client had heard the ruckus and would be coming to investigate. If she could arrange to meet him halfway. A movement at the corner of her eye was her only warning, but it was enough. Even as she threw herself to the side in a flat dive, a blaster bolt sizzled through the air where she'd been standing. She rolled back to her knees, eyes sweeping the raised section of rooftop and locating her assailant. A prone figure in a black poncho and hood, the protruding snout of his blaster rifle tracking towards her. Snapping her hand up, Shada threw Carolee's knife towards him. The sniper rolled instantly to the side, leaning his head into the relative protection of his arms and rifle, the weapon now spitting its deadly fire on repeater mode as it tracked towards her. But in this case, the old bounty hunter's reflex had betrayed him. The knife spun precisely into its intended target, not the dodging sniper himself, but the flicker of blaster fire from his weapon. It cut across right in front of the gun barrel, the bolts catching the blade and blasting it apart in a blaze of molten shards and reflected light. And for the next pair of heartbeats, the sniper would be effectively blind. 2 heartbeats was all Shada needed. She came all the way up off the roof, leaping over the sputtering blaster fire now tracking blindly towards her, fingers darting into her plaited hair for one of the lacquered Zenji needles. It came free in a cascade of loosened coils, and as her feet hit the roof, she threw it. And with a muffled clatter, the blaster fell silent. She was beside the sniper in an instant, twisting the weapon out of the dead man's hands and running across the roof. If the sniper was merely the backup and not the main attack, she might still have failed. Skidding to a halt beside the skylight, she crouched at its edge and peered down into the high-ceilinged room below. She hadn't failed. 3 meters below her was an ornate decorated table, with Mazik and Griv on one side, and the Kubaz and a rough-looking human on the other. The two sides had already exchanged cases and were in the process of checking their new prizes. The Kubaz shut his case after what seemed to be a cursory examination, standing stiffly behind the table with an obvious air of expectation about him. It took Mazik another minute to be similarly satisfied with his side of the trade, then he too closed his case. He nodded pleasantly to the Kubaz and took a step back from the table, his mouth moving with what were probably his usual farewell remarks. The Kubaz remained where he was, and as Mazik and Griv took another step back, his air of expectation gave way to one of puzzlement. His long snout twitched in indecision, clearly wanting to look up, but just as clearly not wanting to telegraph the surprise ending he was still expecting. Still, if a surprise was all he wanted, Shada could oblige him. Lining the blaster rifle up on the base of the alien's long snout, she tapped the barrel lightly against the skylight. All four of them looked up. The Kubaz's expression was impossible to read, but his companions more than made up for it. His mouth fell open in stunned disbelief, his hand dropping to the blaster belted at his side. Shada shifted her aim to his forehead. Slowly, he raised the hand, empty, to his chest. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Mazik throw her an abbreviated salute, and then he and Griv walked out of her field of view. Shada kept her weapon trained on the Kubaz and his friend for a count of 30. Then, throwing them the same salute Mazik had just given her, she backed away from the skylight. "It's over?" Carolee's voice asked from behind her. Shada turned to look. The younger woman was standing beside the dead assassin at the edge of the upper roof, her expression impossible to read. "Yes," Shada told her. "Your client decided not to go back on the deal after all." Carolee looked down at the body at her feet. "The 11 aren't going to be happy about this." "I'm used to people not being happy with me," Shada sighed, lowering the blaster rifle to the rooftop. "I'll get by." "This is not a joking matter, Shada," Carolee growled. "You've been given a direct order. You stay with Mazik now, and they'll have a squad on you before the week's over." "I'm not staying with Mazik," Shada said. "As I told you, I'll resign as his bodyguard tonight." "And you think that will fix this with the 11? Carolee scoffed. "I suppose that depends on whether any of them still remembers who we are," Shada said, a deep sense of sadness flowing into her. A sadness that felt as if it had been collecting around her heart for a long, long time. "The Mistral that I joined 22 years ago was an honorable clan of warriors fighting to preserve what was left of our people. Honorable warriors don't knowingly deal in murder. I would hope at least some of the 11 remember that." "Maybe the 11 have changed." Carolee looked away across the dark rooftops of the city. "Maybe the Mistral have changed." "Maybe they have," Shada said. "But I haven't." She studied her friend. "But then, neither have you." Carolee looked back at her. "Really? I'd like to know what I said to give you that impression." "It's not what you said," Shada told her. "It's what you did. After I kicked your blaster away, when you pulled that knife on me." "Pulling a knife convinced you I was on your side?" "Yes," Shada said. "You still have my blaster." Carolee put her hand to her side. "Yes, I suppose I do. I imagine you want it back." Shada shrugged. "It might be harder to explain what happened here if you still have it when you go back to Emberline." "Point," Carolee conceded. She flicked her wrist, and the blaster sailed in a flat arc to drop neatly into Shada's waiting hand. "Speaking of Emberline, I'd stay away from there if I were you. For that matter, I'd stay away from any other Mistral, period. For the next 10 years, if you can manage it." "I won't need to hide that long," Shada said, sliding the blaster back into its holster. "Looks like the galaxy is coming to a boil again over this Kamas thing. The 11 will soon have more important things than me to think about." Carolee spat something. "Kamas. Kamas and Alderaan, and even that Mudwater Nogri planet Honager. It almost makes me laugh sometimes when I think about which worlds get cried over." "Being bitter about it won't help," Shada said. "So what will?" Carolee retorted. "At least being bitter proves you're not dead yet." "Perhaps," Shada said, "if that's what you're willing to settle for." "I suppose you found something better?" "I don't know," Shada said. "There has to be something, though." She pointed to a small rectangular shed-like structure on the far side of the skylight. "That the exit over there?" "One of them," Carolee said. if you don't mind taking a chance on running into the Kubaz and his pals on the way down. Shada smiled tightly. They'll make room for me. Almost unwillingly, Carolee smiled back. I'm sure they will. The smile faded. But understand this, Shada. Whatever I did here, I did it for, well, the reasons are complicated. But if the 11 send me after you... I understand, Shada nodded. I'll try not to put you in this position again. Never mind me, Carolee said. You just be careful of you. She cocked her head slightly. You have any idea what you're going to do? Shada looked up at the stars. As a matter of fact, she said quietly, I do. Hold still, please, sir, the MD droid said in its deep voice, its mechanical fingers wielding the probe with microscopic precision as he lined it up. I expect this to be the final pass. Good, Luke said, taking a deep breath and cultivating his patience. He'd been sitting here for nearly half an hour now, but it was almost over. The droid eased the probe into Luke's right ear with a sensation that oscillated between an itch and a tickle. Luke braced himself, and then with a loud slurping sound, it was over. Thank you, sir, the MD said, lowering the probe into the reclamation container beside him and discharging a final few drops of Bacta into it. I again apologize for the time and inconvenience this has caused you. That's all right, Luke assured him, sliding off the table and rubbing the last vestige of the itch tickle away with a fingertip. I know it's easy to say there'll never be another Bacta shortage like the one during the war. It's not always so easy to believe it. I was with this facility during that time, the MD said gravely. We could not afford to buy the black market Bacta, even if it had been available to us. I saw many die who could have been saved. Luke nodded. And as a result, for the past 12 years, the medics in charge had made it the rigid policy to conserve every single drop of Bacta, even to the point of siphoning it out of patients' ears when necessary. I can't say this last part was very pleasant, he said. On the other hand, I'd hate to have arrived and found out that you didn't have enough Bacta to treat me. Perhaps it is simply the path of old habit, the droid said. Still, I am told it is wise to remember the past. It is indeed, Luke agreed soberly, nodding to the Bacta reclamation container. And even wiser to learn from it. R2 was waiting in their assigned rooms, plugged into the desk and warbling softly to himself as he conversed with the medical facility's main computer. His dome swiveled as Luke came in, the warbling changing to an excited whistling. Hi, R2, Luke said. Keeping busy? The little droid made an affirmative-sounding twitter, which changed to something questioning. Oh, I'm fine, Luke assured him, patting his side. Some of the shrapnel was in pretty deep, but they got it all out. A little dip in a Bacta tank and I'm good as new. The medic said I shouldn't fly for another hour or so, but it'll probably take that long to get the ship rolled out and prepared anyway. R2 whistled again, rotating his dome around in a complete circle. Yes, I see they did a good job with you too, Luke agreed. Did you ask them to take a look at the X-Wing? Another affirmative twitter. Good, Luke said. Then I guess the only question left is where we should go next. R2's dome swiveled back again to face him, a distinctly suspicious note in the next warble. We're not out here on vacation, R2, Luke reminded him, pulling up a chair beside the droid where he could keep an eye on the desk's computer display for more complicated translations. We're here to track down these clones and find out where they're coming from. We're not going to accomplish that by going home to Yavin or Coruscant. He looked out the window at the hills rising steeply behind his room, their carpet of gold-colored grasses gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Yes, the mission statement itself was perfectly straightforward. Unfortunately, the necessary procedure for completing it was anything but. He'd tried the surreptitious approach to the Kavrilhu base. All he'd gotten for his trouble had been yet another swim in a Bacta tank. And, of course, the chance to see Mara again. He grimaced. Mara. He'd been expecting to run into her again ever since that pirate raid he and Han had thwarted off Ivigen. In fact, he wouldn't put it past Han to have had something to do with Mara showing up at the Kauron asteroid field that way. He'd expected to run into her, and had secretly dreaded the prospect. And yet, looking back on it, the encounter hadn't been nearly as tense as he'd feared that it would be. She'd been cooperative and polite, or at least as polite as Mara ever got. More significantly, the quiet but strong animosity he'd sensed radiating towards him at their last couple of brief encounters hadn't been present. Or maybe it had been there, and he just hadn't noticed. Maybe his deliberately diminished use of the Force these days had simply prevented him from sensing that deeply into her mind without a deliberate probe. He scowled out at the hills. There was definitely some kind of cause and effect at work here. That much he was sure of. The question was, which was the cause, and which the effect? R2 warbled questioningly. I'm trying to figure it out, Luke told him, glancing at the translation. Just relax, okay? The droid warbled again and fell into an expectant silence. Luke sighed and settled back into his seat, gazing out at the hills. Mara was a puzzle, but she was a puzzle that would have to wait. At the moment, his immediate future was focused on this cloning question. His future. He glanced back at R2, the memory of their time with Yoda drifting to mind. Luke's Jedi training, and that first time he'd gotten a glimpse into the future. A glimpse that had nearly resulted in disaster. He'd rushed off madly to Cloud City to try to save Han and Leia, and had instead nearly gotten all of them killed. But he'd learned so much about the Force since then, and he had been able to draw other visions of the future without doing anything rash. Lately, his efforts in that direction had been strangely unrewarding, but as long as he was supposed to take it easy for an hour or so anyway, it wouldn't hurt to give it a try. R2, I'm going to meditate for a while, he told the droid, slipping out of the chair and settling himself cross-legged on the floor. See if I can get some direction. Don't let anyone disturb me, all right? The droid buzzed an affirmative. Taking a deep breath, Luke closed his eyes and stretched out to the Force. His thoughts, his emotions, his entire being slipped into the proper pattern, and suddenly the whole universe exploded in front of him into a brilliant kaleidoscope of color and motion. He gasped, the vast image wavering momentarily like desert heat shimmer as he nearly lost control. It was like no vision he'd ever had before, like nothing he'd ever seen before. 100 different scenes, 1,000 different possibilities, brilliant colors, sharp-edged sounds, joy and contentment and fear and death, all of it swirled together with the fury and randomness of a Tatooine sandstorm. Lines of possibility wove around each other or else crashed together, sometimes merging, sometimes bouncing apart again, always forever changed by the encounter. Familiar faces were there among unfamiliar ones, passing in front of him or else flickering behind other events unfolding at the edges of his sight. He caught a glimpse of Wedge and Rogue Squadron as they swept past in the fury of battle, saw his Jedi students inexplicably fanning out across the New Republic, leaving the Yavin Academy all but deserted, saw himself standing on a balcony against the wall of a darkened canyon, gazing down at the sea of thousands of tiny stars, saw Han and Leia facing a huge mob. Han? Leia? With an effort, he grabbed on to that last line, trying to stay with it long enough to see more. For a moment he succeeded, the image sharpening into focus. Leia standing in a wide hallway, her lightsaber blazing in her hands, as a mass of bodies pushed through a tall door. Han standing on a crouchside balcony with drawn blaster, looking down at the crowd. The crowd inside flowed mindlessly forward. A hidden rooftop sniper lined up his blaster rifle. And then they were gone, vanishing into the swirling mass of sights and sounds. For a moment, Luke tried to join the flow himself, the taste of fear mixing with the other sensations of the vision as he tried to catch up and see what was going to happen to them. But they were gone, and with a sense that came from outside himself, he knew that he'd seen all of that vision that he was going to. Easing out of the flow, he made his way back to the single fixed point in the storm, the solidness of his own being. He'd learned all he could here, and now it was time to leave. He began to draw back, the vast array of images beginning to turn and recede and darken. And then, abruptly, one final vision appeared in front of him. Mara, surrounded by craggy rock and floating in water, her eyes closed, her arms and legs limp, as if in death. Wait! He heard himself shout, but it was too late. Mara's image faded with the rest of the vision. and with a sudden gasp of air, he found himself back in his room, gazing out the window at the hills. Hills that no longer glowed golden, but were instead outlined by the subtler gloss of starlight. Excuse me. Whoa, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. He would have sworn that vision had only lasted a few minutes. Beside him, R2 twittered in obvious relief. Yes, it took longer than I expected too, Luke agreed. Sorry. The droid warbled questioningly, getting to his feet, wincing at the sudden prickling sensation in muscles left too long in one position. Luke looked at the question scrolling across the computer display. I don't know, he had to concede. I saw a lot of things, but I didn't see anything that seemed to have anything to do with our search. Which might mean, he realized subtly, that hunting for clones was no longer what he was supposed to be doing. But then, what was he supposed to do? Go to wherever Han and Leia were and warn them? Go find Mara and warn her? He took a deep breath, shifting tired muscles. Always in motion is the future, Yoda had told him after that first vision on Dagobah. At the time, Luke had wondered about that remark. His vision of Han and Leia in Cloud City had seemed so simple and straightforward. But if Yoda had instead seen something more akin to this last vision, with all its tangles and complications, then it all made sense. Or had he seen something like that? Could it be that what Luke had experienced here was something entirely different? A special event reserved for special occasions? It was an intriguing possibility, but for the moment it was an issue he could put aside. What mattered was that he'd received the guidance he'd sought and needed to act on it. All he had to do was figure out exactly what that guidance was. Stepping over to the window, he looked up at the stars. You will know, Yoda had told him, when you are calm, at peace. Taking a deep breath, Luke set about calming his mind. R2's soft warbling was starting to take on a concerned tone by the time he turned back around. All right, he told the droid. I saw a world with a wide, deep canyon that had buildings built into the sides and lots of lights at the bottom. Check the main computer and see where that might be. R2 warbled in acknowledgement and jacked into the computer outlet. Luke stepped to his side and watched as a planet name and description came up on the display. No, it wasn't Balsavis, he said. The surface wasn't covered with glaciers, and there were no domes. It was also a lot more pleasant. He frowned, pulling the image back from his memory. There were bridges arcing all the way across the canyon, I saw. I saw a group of 9 of them, arranged in a diamond pattern, one starting on one level, 2 more side by side crossing for the next level down, 3 on the next, then 2, and then 1. R2 whistled and searched some more. A half dozen more systems scrolled across the display. Wait a minute, Luke said. Back up one. Sajansi system. See if there are any pictures in the data file. The display backed up, then altered to a succession of orbital, aerial, and ground pictures. Luke watched as they went past, and by the time the series had come to an end, he knew it was the place. That's it, he said. The canyonade on Sesjani. That's where we're going. The droid twittered uncertainly, his question scrolling across the bottom of the screen. I don't know why, Luke told him. I just know I need to go there. There was another twitter, this one sounding slightly incredulous. To be honest, I don't understand it myself, Luke conceded. I saw a lot of things in that vision, things that are happening or maybe are about to happen. I saw my students leaving the academy. Why, I don't know. I saw Leia and Han in some kind of trouble. The droid warbled anxiously, and another question appeared. No, I don't know if 3PO was with them, Luke told him. The point is that there are a lot of places out there where we could go where I might be able to affect things. Too many places. He pointed at the view of the vast canyon. But the canyonade is the only place where I actually saw myself. The one part of the vision where I felt peace. He looked out at the stars again. So that's where we'll go. For a moment there was silence. Then R2 warbled again. Point taken, Luke agreed with a smile. If we're going to go, let's stop dithering and go. Besides which, he told himself as they headed for the docking bay, Leia's a Jedi in her own right. She can take care of herself. And Han's got a long history of beating the odds, too. And Rogue Squadron could manage without him. And wherever his Jedi students had been going, they surely had a good reason for doing so. Whatever this trip to Sisjasi was all about, all of them could do without him for a while. 40 minutes later, once again in space, he pulled the hyperdrive lever and sent the X-Wing jumping to light speed, trying hard not to think about the vision he'd had of Mara. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Sorry for the coughing spells. Talk to you again real soon.